Welcome to the party. It's Webinar Wednesday here at Shaparency, well, once a month. Today's live webinar is Dynamics of a Killer Strategy for Businesses and Boards. The purpose of the webinars we host is to educate, inspire, and empower global leaders like you to help modernize boards and ultimately make boards more efficient. Our guest speakers bring leadership and board-related topics to the table, and shortly you'll meet Tom Ricca-McCarthy. He will bring clarity to the complex topic of strategy, and he will also show us how having the right plan, well communicated and efficiently executed, is actually the best way to make an impact. My name is Red, Head of Events for Shaparency and today's webinar moderator. Before we begin, let me introduce you to our webinar host, Shaparency. We are the most cost-effective and powerful board portal in the world, and up to 80% less expensive than our competitors. Our world-class collaboration tools help future-thinking boards level up their digital processes. There's a steady stream of exciting new product updates to the platform at any given time. If you haven't already, get your 14-day free trial and try it yourself and, of course, for your board in your environment. 3 quick reminders before we begin. Write your question in the Q&A section as we go. If we do run out of time to answer your question, we promise to follow up with you after the webinar. Just make sure that it's not an anonymous question, because then we wouldn't know who to reach out to. This webinar is also being recorded, and you will receive a link to the video recording as well as the presentation deck, and that's within the next day or so. A lot of people are upping the game to become a modern-day board director through the globally recognized IBDC.D board education and certification program. Shaparency is a board education partner of IBDC.D, and attending the webinar today offers a CPE credit opportunity for certification holders. All right, here we are. I am happy to present today's webinar speaker, Tom Ricca-McCarthy. There is so much to say about Tom. So just to scratch the surface, here is my intro, and I recommend connecting with him on LinkedIn following the webinar. Tom is the co-founder of Lucidity. He started Lucidity to make a difference through strategy, making it more accessible to people and organizations. He's a specialist in growing teams and organizations internationally. Tom is also a non-executive director, a growth fund mentor in the social, health, and environmental sectors, and author at Oxford University Press. He is a CEO with a long track record in technology, telecommunications, IT, and also in software, starting about 20 years ago. Tom has a degree in engineering, but spent most of his time and effort on numbers, sales, and marketing. He was awarded Times Top 100 SME, Top 100, and Top 10 4 years in a row. And Lucidity was voted the best place to work in the UK and Europe. Here is Tom Ricca-McCarthy and Dynamics of a Killer Strategy for Businesses and Boards. Welcome, Tom, to our virtual stage.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the intro, Red. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. Thank you for the intro. So yes, I have had a fairly rounded experience and track record in terms of growing things and turning things around. Just a few examples here, and I think the common denominator really is each of those examples was about putting in place a simple strategy and then making it happen to deliver some results and to improve situation for a business and or for some teams. So in terms of what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to try to get everyone on the same page first, actually, and let's just agree on or provide an accessible view of what sort of strategy is. I'm then going to sort of go through some problems with strategy, and I'm doing this so that perhaps the board members on the call can appreciate perhaps what their management teams are going through, and for the senior management teams and the leaders, they can also perhaps get a bit of a better understanding of how their boards are viewing strategy and how their boards can be engaged. So boards, management team and strategy tries to sort of play to both types of the attendee on the call. The original topic of the call was the killer strategy, and so that's quite a tall order, but I tried to sort of cover that off in 5 key points. I think 5 key critical things that are going to really make a difference to a strategy being effective or not effective. And then lastly, just a few resources I could highlight, a little bit of reading that's recommended. And then I think we break out into Q&A, which Red will manage for us. So first of all, I just want to get everyone on the same page, because if you ask 10 people what's strategy, you tend to get sort of 10 different answers. So let's just agree on something. So if we can agree on a strategy being a plan of action designed to achieve a long-term goal or aim, that seems to me a fairly innocuous summary of what a strategy is. And I think it's also worth sort of reiterating why strategy is important, because I quite often bump into leaders and teams and that doesn't really come across. So this is really around growing an organization, having a strategy in place that's good. It's about growing an organization for that business to be successful, to provide safety for the business and livelihoods. If I look back at my own experiences, having a strategy in place, driving success has been a really fantastic experience in terms of personal development, and also for the people that have worked for me. It's fun, and if you're being successful, you're seeing some rewards. So there's some really key and good reasons why strategy is important. In terms of, so what's the overall aim or the overall vision? We've probably heard of sort of vision statements. So, what is that? That's casting forward, it's looking ahead, it's articulating what your ambition is. 2 examples here: Monzo, building a new kind of bank. This was a new entrant to the UK banking sector some years ago, bored with and unhappy with all of the service experiences from the incumbent banks. And then a non-profit example, a world without Alzheimer's, which is obviously a fantastic sort of bold vision statement for a non-profit organization. So there's 2 nice examples of aims or visions there. And then, of course, we've got to think, well, okay, we've got the vision, we've got the passion and ambition. How do we get there? So I'm not going to go into these particular sort of tools in detail. There's video content of this sort of that sort of activity on our site. But I typically go through with a team, or I would encourage a team to go through on the left, looking at what's going on outside your organization in a structured way. That can be quite challenging. So a suggested tool would be something like Pestle to do that in a structured way. Porters to look at a market. Should you stay in a market, or should you enter a different market based on profitability? So Porter's 5 forces would be a sensible tool to sort of consider those things. Revenue segmentation seems so obvious, but I quite often ask a management team, where does the revenue really come from? Where does the profit really come from in terms of territories, products, services, or customer types? And so that basic analysis there is really critical at the start of the strategy process. And lastly, sort of pulling all of that together into a SWOT, very basic but powerful tool: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So I would always encourage a simple approach to some analysis. Keep it simple, keep everyone engaged in that. If you make it too complicated or arduous, you'll lose some of the management team, and that's not good. So then you're probably coming out with some options: strategic options, market penetration perhaps, keep doing more of what you're doing, product development to complement what you're already up to, or perhaps some market development where you want to go into a new territory or a new market. And you can assess those strategic options down the bottom there in terms of suitability, acceptability, and feasibility. Are they suitable? Is it acceptable? Or is everyone going to leave? And is it really feasible? And you can, do a fairly basic scoring matrix there to really try to decide which option to pursue. So that's sort of, got you a sort of a vision, perhaps a decision around how you're going to get there. And then in terms of what does a strategic plan look like? Well, we have that vision. We have a handful of strategic objectives there. 3 to 6, less than 3, you've probably not thought hard enough. More than 6 or 7, you might be overcomplicating things. So the strategic objectives, the big things that are going to underpin that vision, broken down into goals or activities, KPIs, and then broken down into tasks. So this is really simple, it's structured, it's logical. Anyone can look at this sort of thing and understand it and start to engage. In real life, what do those strategic objectives look like? Typically financial, customer or market orientated, operational, growth, attracting and retaining talent, things like that. And then we just break down into further detail, financial growth, the main components of that. Then we're starting to grow a plan by adding in tasks, owners, deadlines, and clear accountability that's really critical. Keeping a strategy live with live data is, good practice. As soon as you start putting this stuff into sort of documents that then get lost in files, then that's no good. This is all about having a strategy that's alive, kept up to date, and there's a single source of truth with live data in it. That's good practice. And so, as you can see, we've gone through a really basic planning exercise. We've built out a plan. And then lastly, in terms of communication, personally, I'm not really inspired by looking at spreadsheets, and I don't think other people are. So, great practice to visualize and communicate your strategy in a really simple way to employees and other stakeholders. So that's sort of 2 minutes on just to get us on the same page. What's the strategy? What are the main components? What does some basic strategic planning and activity look like? So let's next look at some of the sort of problems with strategy, because then as board members or as senior managers, you can hopefully sort of reflect on where you are and figure out what some areas that you might need to focus on yourselves. There are lots of problems with strategy. On the left there, it tends to be quite sort of poorly formulated. Lack of time is a problem, but also an excuse. There's definitely a lack of knowledge out there and confidence, as I'll come to. And I think it's sort of become quite an inaccessible or certainly a nebulous subject. We have strategy academics on our board, and I regularly take them to task saying that they've actually made things a bit too complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated, and in fact, simple is good. And tooling is quite poor. And if you look at some data from MIT, businesses below 250 employees, lots of them do not have a strategy. In the middle here, employees don't really engage with strategy. This is a big problem. They're not communicated with, or they're communicated with poorly, and strategy has a low visibility. It's difficult to relate to, hard to understand. And I think sort of probably the most worrying stats in my talk today are these two things. A third of leaders not being able to list a single one of their company's strategic objectives, or only 13% of frontline staff being able to do that. Now, if you think about that just for a second, that's really concerning. So leaders aren't quite sure, and the people bringing in new revenues and looking after customers, even fewer of them are comfortable with what's happening, and also where they fit in and how they contribute, which is really important for employee retention these days. And lastly, on the right, there's a lot of friction to do with strategy. There's plans all over the place, too many spreadsheets, too many PowerPoints. It's difficult to monitor, nothing's up to date. And that makes it really difficult to get focus, to build up some momentum and maintain that. And that can take a lot of time and energy out of the management team. And so, there's problems with strategy, and lots of strategies fail. A couple of years ago, this data is about 2 years old, we ran a webinar with 180 high growth businesses in the UK, predominantly, I think this was. And we asked them, and most of the audience here were chief executives. So board members, this might be how some of your chief execs are feeling. So, and as you can see here, a lot of chief executives were really, didn't feel confident about the process of building out a strategy, time to do it, etc. So there's some real concerns there. People aren't comfortable with strategy in terms of building it, and then in terms of executing it, similarly, lack of time, lack of money, lack of expertise. So there's quite a lot of problems here where business leaders are saying, I'm not very comfortable, I'm not quite sure what to do. So I think for a board should reflect on how well equipped their management team are, and also what sort of help they're giving. Another survey we ran last year was to about 500 chief strategy officers, bigger businesses up to say 10,000 employees, this particular survey was, I think. And we asked them, one of the questions we asked them was, what are the biggest challenges around strategy? And as you can see here, the biggest challenge was actually getting teams to adequately prioritize strategy over business as usual, keeping the strategy visible, managing team alignment. And also within that survey, we asked them, what tools are you using? 94% saying they're using basically PowerPoint, 87% using spreadsheets. So really complex challenges with strategy, and yet, organizations not using particularly good tools. So what does this lead to? So McKinsey have a sort of a grimly named image, which is called the hairy back of reality. And that being, as you can see here, there are a series of hockey sticks. People are putting up the 2011 plan, the 2012 plan, the 2013 plan, promising growth and results. And the reality is the performance of the business, flatlines and or declines. And so, there's quite a high failure rate strategy, and ultimately, in some cases, business failure. So what can sort of boards, management teams, how can they react and interact around this this subject? And so coming onto the call and preparing for it, I sort of reflected, well, who should lead on strategy? So does the chief executive lead? Does the chief exec say this is it? And actually on the left there, then the board is just a rubber stamp, and the board's not really delivering any real value. But then on the right there, does the board lead? Does the board tell the management team and the chief exec, this is it, this is the plan? That can obviously be quite adversarial, and also, that's not exactly empowering a management team that you're probably spending a lot of money on. So of course, the reality is somewhat more nuanced. So a survey we did this year in the voluntary sector, we surveyed out about 600 and something chief executives in the charity space. And one of the questions was, well, who's responsible for the strategy? And as you can see here, actually, then the reality is somewhat more nuanced. Yellow and green, the vast majority of teams were collaborating. The chief executive and the trustees, the board of trustees and a charity were collaborating on the strategy. And as you can see there, a real minority, in a minority of cases, either the chief executive was saying, this is the plan, or the trustees were saying, this is the plan. So I think probably collaboration there is an obvious answer between board and management, depending on personalities, but also on the right. It can really depend on a number of other factors. I think in the US, board oversight is tighter than in the UK, for example, and much, much tighter than board oversight in Russia. So depending on where you are, that can really influence how much involvement a board has in the strategy. The size and the age of the business obviously is going to be another factor. Early stage businesses tend to pull in board members that will really help them execute and grow, but much bigger and much older organizations are probably pulling in and populating their boards with people who are there to ensure good governance, compliance, etc. So that's obviously going to affect the interaction between board and management teams in terms of strategy. And then the last couple of points there, of course, actually I thought about are levels of growth. If things are going well, if a business is growing, then a board ought to get out of the way. Let the management team get on with it. Why distract them? If a business, the performance is flat, then I would imagine a board ought to be sort of asking a few questions, having a look at the plan, etc. And of course, if a business is in decline or entering a sort of a chaotic phase, then a board equally should probably step in, take a grip of things, and possibly even change management out. So, there's a number of factors there that are going to affect the board and the management team. But I think from preparing and thinking for this talk, I think there's two things that came out to me that ought to be discussed and agreed between a board and a management team. One is, for this organization, what is the strategy? What is strategy? Is it about planning? Is it about the competitive strategy and the positioning of the organization? Is it to overcome key challenges? or is it reinforcing core competencies or creating stakeholder value for the stakeholders? So I think there needs to probably be a discussion about those points and an agreement on this is what strategy is for this organization at this point of time. And on the right there, I think it's probably healthy to have an upfront proactive conversation to say, what's the role of the board here? Is the board advising? Is it supervising? Is it going a bit further there? Is it just going to be supportive and basically react and get involved on demand by the management team? Is it playing a much more of an external view, wider world view and experiences? Is it really focused on the investment activity? So what investment is required to execute a strategy, the sign off from that and the agreement of a return on investment. So again, so there's two things there: what strategy for the organization, and also what's the role of the board. They're two probably quite critical points for an executive team and a board to discuss and agree on. A couple of smaller things that sort of struck me. I use this slide when I talk to a management team about behavior. You know, SWOT's a simple tool, but really powerful and useful. And a board and management team, you know, ought to be on top left, sort of recognizing, protecting and growing the strengths of the business. Weaknesses ought to be, personally as a chief executive, I spend a lot of time in the weakness box because you know, with authority, you can cut through problems. They're the problems within an organization. So as a chief exec, or possibly arguably as a board, you can cut through those weaknesses and remove them more quickly than other people can. Opportunities need to be, you know, chosen, focused on and invested. And also, as we'll come on to, equally important is stopping other activity that's strategically unimportant. And you know, you'd very much expect a board to have an external view and be really identifying and articulating threats to the business. And those bottom two sort of boxes there, the rectangle there, the green thing, is just to highlight that they're very much sort of more external and more the territory for a board. The other sort of scenario and strategy tool where I would expect the board to get involved with and or work with the management team is very much, so the Ansoff matrix, when you're really looking at strategic options. You know, so this is about diversification. Do you need to diversify for the reasons on the left: growth, risk, survival, synergies? And then if you look in the actual table, so if you're going to just focus on market penetration, so that's doing more of the same. I would sort of probably expect a management team to be capable of focusing, you know, carrying out that strategic option by themselves. Product development, possibly more involving board and management, because it's probably going to require some investment. Similarly, market development, heading off into new territories. The two examples I've got highlighted there, which is a whole other talk. Tesco entering the US was a massive failure. Volkswagen entering the US was a huge success. Product development and market development probably require some investment, and that's probably going to come in front of the board. And then full diversification, which is new products to new markets, then you know, the risk involved there would probably also involve board conversation. So there's a couple of tools there, I think, where management and boards can talk over in terms of you know, input, advice, etc. So the next couple of slides, we're going to look at why strategies fail and succeed, and I'm highlighting where the boards can really make a difference. And actually, so in this particular structure, we've got formulate, alignment, and execution as the three main activities within a successful plan. And my argument is that the boards of directors can make a real difference in the green. Now, this is actually easier to get across if we look at this in a positive context. So my argument is that, all right, I think that, you know, good practice for boards of directors in terms of strategy is on the left there, making strategy a regular activity, really discussing true alternatives. So the strategy offsite where someone shows up with a 200 strong slide deck, that's not discussing true alternatives. And I think a board of directors is particularly well positioned to discuss true alternatives. using data and facts as part of your strategic planning is absolutely critical. Cognitive bias is a known problem, you know, using data that supports what you want to do and ignoring data that doesn't. And I think a board of directors there can demand, or should demand, data and facts as part of any sort of strategic planning exercise. Starting, stopping and continuing, you know, what gets investment. I'm going to come on to that in a little more detail. Being bold, I think, is really good practice. You know, in terms of good strategies tend to be quite bold. They tend to be quite simple, but quite bold. And then making things sure things are funded and investment is correct. And then on the right there, I think in terms of execution, then this is all about ensuring that the right balance of resources is there. Monitoring and reporting is consistent and regular. So, you know, I think management teams ought to be really tracking their strategy on a weekly basis, performance against strategy, and boards ought to be doing that on a monthly basis. And that regular monitoring and reporting just sort of becomes a virtuous circle and drives the right behavior. And lastly there, I think not letting things slip backwards. So I sit on a couple of boards as non-exec, and I see my role there as being a one-way valve. So I'll help the management team move forward, but I won't let them move backwards. And I think that again is another that's another sort of welcome role, I think, for a board. So the topic of the conversation, the talk today, was the killer strategy, that's a big question. And I sort of have had a bit of a think about this. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to go through sort of 5 points, but I reflected on the previous slide, and actually, if a management team and a board are working together on that left-hand column, and they are really nailing each of those points, then you know, you're well on the way to having a strategy that is going to be bold, well-resourced, well thought through, well-funded, and well supported. And then on the right there, in terms of just making sure that you're focusing on those key aspects of execution, then that set of behaviors, I think, will get you a long way to having a strategy that's well thought through and well executed. If we look at it though in a little bit more detail, there are some things that I think can really help a strategy become successful. The first thing is actually planning for a lack of engagement. So as I mentioned earlier on, you know, there are problems with getting people to engage with strategy. We talked about employees. We asked chief strategy officers, you know, and their frustration is people just doing the day-to-day rather than prioritizing the important stuff. So why not have a think about your organization, the stakeholders on the left, whether they be the senior managers, the finance team, marketing, employees themselves. What are the likely engagement risks? So if we take senior managers, an unspoken lack of buy-in. So you're in the strategy workshop, you're in the offsite, everyone's nodding and saying the right things, but actually they're not bought into it. There's a tendency towards caution and status quo and protecting that status quo. And as we touched on, there's cognitive bias of just using data that supports what you want to do. And they're very real issues. So the question is, well, how do you mitigate those things? So involve everybody in the formulation, you know, create an environment where there's open and honest discussion. And, you know, a critical thing is using data. So the next thing down, and I won't go through all of them, but let's just touch on finance. A classic mistake is not enough investment in the new activities. You know, too much investment sitting in historic activities, or finance communicating out to everyone using spreadsheets, which just doesn't cut it. So again, on the right there, you know, how can the finance team and sales really agree together the investment and the return, and then sort of other people being responsible for communication. So the point is here, whatever your organization is, think about why this strategy isn't going to get traction and then do something about it, but be proactive around that. Don't be reactive to the problem. The second really critical thing is, and when we used to pre-COVID, you know, we'd run the, you know, offsite workshops, that sort of thing. This was always the moment where you could see a management team start to think strategically. Very simple tool, start, stop, continue. It's all about strategy being a choice. It's about what you're choosing to focus on, and equally important, what you therefore have to stop. Because you have to stop certain activities to create the oxygen for the new stuff. Otherwise, you're not going to grow. Okay. So what does this look like? So you're going to continue your activities that are good to high revenue, good to high profit, healthy, non-toxic. You can compete. So that's all good stuff. You want to keep doing that. But part of formulating a strategy is deciding on what you're going to stop doing. So these are the things that don't really contribute to the business: products, customers, territories, officers that don't contribute revenue or profit. There's no growth in them, and they're in decline longer term. And they're difficult for you in some way. It could be toxic customers, toxic products that take a lot of time and energy out of your organization. And they're going to hold you back. You can't compete. There's no USP. So you have to stop those activities, those territories, those products, services, whatever. And then on the right there, then you're creating some space for the new activities. So where's the growth? Where's the substantial revenue and profit? The good mid to long-term growth. It's healthy. It's not toxic. You can compete. And this is where things get difficult. And this is where senior leaders and boards have to be brave, because this is about stopping doing certain activities. And this is difficult. This is the difficult bit of strategy, when personalities and the social side come in to make some of these decisions really hard. So, be brave here. And then the other point here which is really critical, is make sure this stuff on the right is funded properly. Okay, so you've got to stop the old stuff and you've got to start the new stuff, and be brave about that funding. And McKinsey have an expression for getting this wrong, and they call it peanut butter, because what you're doing is you're not stopping stuff and you're not funding the new stuff properly. And so you're spreading yourself, you're spreading the organization and funds too thinly. That's a bit of a classic mistake. Perhaps reflect on that, take those points on board. Start, stop, continue, really simple tool, even at an organizational level. The third characteristic we see regularly of good strategic behavior is really, really clear and engaging goal setting. And this is such a simple thing. On the left here, we've got examples of poor practice. So remember some of that, that strategic planning structure we had.
Tom, you have
where you've got your strategic objectives, initiatives, projects, goals. So on the left here, we've got the change program. We've got some team design. They're ambiguous, they're unexciting, timing is not clear.
Tom, your reception is not great right now. So I don't know if you can hear me right now. Your reception is going in and out.
No owners.
Tom? Tom?
Yeah.
Your reception.
Red, can you hear me?
Yes, your reception is going a little bit in and out right now.
Can you hear me, Red?
Yes, I can hear you now, but it's going a little bit in and out as you speak now, the last 30 seconds.
Red, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Hi, Red.
Yep, you're good. Let's see if we cannot hear you right now, so I don't know if there's anything that you can do with checking your connection.
Red, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Is there any way you can check your connection?
Okay, sorry about that. It looks okay my end, so apologies.
Good. Perfect.
No owners, deadlines, etc. It must be bad at your end. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
On the right here, okay. Yeah, I just did actually. It looks okay. So hopefully that's hopefully I'm back. Perhaps I was just talking too fast. So on the right, good practice, just good, clear goals, concise, owners, etc. And what you've got there is a difference of people wanting to be involved in initiatives or projects. People aren't going to really run to be involved with things on the left, but they probably will want to be involved with things on the right. And this is a really simple, aspect of strategy that can make a real difference. So, think about that, think about the language, think about the detail around your strategic planning. Communication is really critical, and I feel really sort of passionate about this. I turned around a business once, and we had a strategy, and we were just relentless at communicating to the team about what the strategy was, progress against it. Every week, every day, every week, every month, every quarter, and it would have been impossible to be in that business to not know what the plan was and not understand where you fitted into it. This is really, really important. We won awards for that particular sort of activity. Visualize the strategy, have it up on the walls, have it in whatever sort of formats and materials you want, but just really communicate this, make it engaging, use, visuals, iconography, keep it simple. Provide a way to get feedback. It's really important to get feedback. Employees need to understand where they fit in and how they contribute, and equally you should be seeking feedback from them. So communication is really critical, and it makes this a huge difference between a strategy that's going to be successful and a strategy that isn't going to be successful. And the last point out of the top 5 is just to be relentless. And there's no getting away from this. Strategy is a long-term engagement. It's a long-term activity. The expression of it being a marathon, not a sprint. Going away for the offsite is not the strategy. The work starts when you get back from the offsite, and the work has to be continued for the next 3 years or 5 years, however long that plan is. And all of these points here on the left, actually, I think, apply to a board as much.
Tom, you cut up. Tom. Tom.
As they do a management team. Certainly the top one, in terms of leading from the top, if the board strategic activity, then no one else will. Meetings focus on strategy, aspects of the strategy in the same way the man. There's a lot of nice dashboard text. I can hear you, Red.
Yes, you're going Red, a little bit in and out.
Okay.
Your reception is a little bit in and out, and also a little time check for you.
Okay, thanks for the time check. Yeah, I
can hear you now, Tom.
Yeah, I'm on time. So just be relentless. It's a long-term activity. So be consistent in your activity, lead from the top, and exhibit the strategic behaviors that you want to see from the rest of the teams. So lastly, before I hand back to Red for Q&A, just a few resources. So the first thing is we have a lot of material on our site, ebooks, articles, webinar recordings. So please, feel free to use all of those free resources. Some of the tools I talked about today and how to build a growth strategy in much more detail are there, involving myself and some of our strategy academics. So there's some good quality material there. In terms of some reading, just a few favorites. Strategy Beyond the Hockey Stick came out a couple of years ago by 3 of the McKinsey guys. It's a great book. I think one of the reasons being that it covers the social aspects of strategy as well as the numbers. So the status quo, getting people engaged and on board with a plan, etc. It's a great book, and the 8 key points there that I put in there as a summary are really critical. Annual to always, debating real alternatives, peanut butter to focus. It's all top class stuff. So that's a great book. Strategy that works. So this came out of PwC. Again, a handful of really key points there. That's a solid book, easy to read. Playing to Win, written by the Chairman, Chief Executive Procter & Gamble. Again, it simplifies strategy, I think, in a great way, obviously from a large corporate. And lastly, a bit of a classic, but I think it's very relevant to any leadership teams driving a strategy, and that's Kotter and Leading Change. And again, you know, the 8 key points here are really critical. If you are leading a strategy, particularly where you're diversifying, for example, and you're really trying to sort of drive new behaviors, you know, new products, new markets, new customers, etc. So Red, I think that my contact details are there, and I know, Red, that you distribute the slides. So hopefully if people want to get in touch with me, you very much can. And I think, Red, at this point, I stop sharing and it's over to you for questions.
I appreciate it very much so, Tom. This was really interesting and intense, and glad to have you back. We had a little bit of a connection problem, but I think we covered most of it, and you will, as Tom said, also receive these slides and the recording, so that will all make sense. I'm going to jump right into the Q&A, Tom. So I see quite a few questions coming in here. So let me start with this one. How do you recommend integrating values and culture into a strategy?
That's a really interesting question. So I think in terms of, let me do culture first. I think in my own experience and having sort of observed other organizations, what you tend to see is at the same time as some strategic planning, then you tend to see the sort of analysis of culture in terms of values, value workshops across an organization and up and down an organization. So whether you're sort of doing that work in advance of a strategy or strategic planning, or whether you're doing that sort of after the plan, I guess it remains a question. But I think in terms of that sort of culture piece, a well-trodden approach is engaging with all employees at all different levels and across the organization to really understand what the sort of values of the business are and how they relate to the strategy, how they support it, and equally to identify perhaps where they don't. And could you just repeat the question in terms of the value piece?
How do you recommend integrating values and culture into a strategy?
Okay, yeah, so it was values, right? Yeah, so sorry, I thought you said value, not values. Yeah, so that would be my answer. So as I say, it's normally external facilitation, I think, is quite important in those types of workshops, so that you're getting people, you know, people feel there's an open and honest environment, a safe environment to share what they want to share. To have the external facilitation, you know, collating, you know, whatever's said, structuring it, playing that back, etc. So yeah, that's I think that's the answer there, Red. Whether that's done sort of, you know, it's definitely done as part of the strategic planning activity. Whether it's done before the plan or just after it, I don't know, actually. I don't know, but that would be the approach.
Great, thank you. And Sophie is asking, hi, how can you best keep the strategy alive? What would be your tip? Okay,
so a number of answers there. I think firstly, it is the tools you're using. So and one of the reasons we're in existence, so as you saw from some of those surveys, the vast majority of organizations, even quite big complex ones, are trying to drive their strategy using effectively Microsoft Office. And it's, you know, you've got a set of complex tasks and you're using some software and some tooling that's just not really appropriate. So I would really urge you to look out for proper tools that are designed, software tools that are designed for organizations to build out and execute their strategies. So that's the part of the answer is the software. I think the second piece of the answer, I think, needs to come from sort of leading from the front. that's the leadership team, you know, really exhibiting the right behaviors and values, prioritizing strategy themselves so that the rest of the organization can see that actually strategy is at the top of the agenda. It's dealt with at 9 o'clock in the morning, not at 5:30 when people are tired. It's at the start of the meeting. It's not at the end of the meeting. And they're the behaviors you actually see in real life. You know, strategy, the strategic stuff's at the end of the list because people are firefighting. But you have to try to break that vicious circle. You really do. And I think that has to sort of come from the top. And then the third piece of the answer, perhaps, is that visual communication piece. And I feel really strongly about that because I feel when I look at big complex spreadsheets, I can feel the energy seeping out of the bottom of my feet. Whilst show me a picture with some color on it and I'm engaged and I'm interested. And I think a lot of people are like that. So I'm trivializing an important message there, but it's really important that visual communication, make it engaging, make it interesting, have it everywhere. That's what we do. And it works. So there's three suggestions there.
Great. And Trey asks, regarding the board's role to recognize, protect, and grow synergies and discuss true alternatives, to what extent do you factor in changes in the human capital landscape into a board strategy?
Well, that's a big question.
Should you read it? Should I read it again, or you got it?
No, I think, well, actually, could you just give that to me again?
Yes. Regarding the board's role to recognize, protect, and grow synergies and discuss true alternatives, to what extent do you factor in changes in the human capital landscape into a board strategy?
Okay, that's a sort of an interesting question. So I think let's try to pick that apart a little bit. I think in terms of discussing true alternatives, I think this is a problem with most businesses and teams, you know, really discussing true alternatives. As I mentioned, the sort of behavior you quite often see is someone showing up at an offsite with 200 slides and making everyone listen to them. And that's really not discussing true alternatives. And I think a board is particularly well positioned to either carry that discussion out or facilitate a discussion like that, because they're slightly more removed and they're therefore slightly less emotional. And I think they have that advantage to provide or create a forum where proper alternatives can be surfaced and discussed in a constructive way. In terms of the human capital bit, I mean, whether you mean sort of changes to the board or you mean the sort of what's going on in terms of you know, sort of recruitment marketplace at the moment, I'm not quite sure. I think if you know, boards of directors tend to be made up, a good board of directors anyway tends to be made up of or should be made up, should I say, of quite diverse people, because you want a mixture of skills, experiences, outlooks on a board. Now, you know, that's diversity in some boards is evident, and equally diversity in other boards is not evident. But I think, you know, a good board has a diverse range of people on it. I think perhaps, I'm hoping I'm asking a question, I think if a board is faced with, you know, having to sort of really discuss some alternatives and isn't really able to because it's not diverse, then I think the chairman ought to do something about that. And perhaps the chairman has to acknowledge that the board needs a shake-up. Management teams need a shake-up every now and again, and a board needs a shake-up every now and again. And so hopefully that answers your question, that perhaps a chairman needs to sort of see that you know, a range of alternatives can't be discussed because the right level of diversity isn't in the board. I hope that's answered your question there. I'm sorry if it hasn't, but email me if I haven't answered it.
Thank you, Tom. And I was going to say that also, Trey, of course, connect with Tom so that if that was not the answer to the question, you can reach out to him. And I see that you also have another question that's coming up. If we don't have time to answer that one, then definitely reach out to Tom. Michael is asking, superb presentation. Often the biggest issue with a strategy is difference of opinion at board level as to the real direction businesses should be taking. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And whether that's a board or whether that's a management team, I'm sure we've all sort of seen or been in those sort of situations. I think I'd touch on a couple of points there. So first, let's acknowledge that this can be difficult. But I think a couple of times in the talk, I've touched on the fact that you really have to use data and facts. Cognitive bias, historical bias, the social, political, personal side of organizations obviously comes into play. But at the end of the day, you know, a board has to do what's right for the long-term good of the organization. So data and facts have to be used. That's a given. The second part of the answer, I think, is, again, I touched on this, but very, very briefly. And the tool, there is a tool in that presentation called the SAFE analysis, and that is, you know, is what's suitable, what's acceptable, what's feasible. So there is that tool's relatively simple. There are other tools out there that can be used to help to make decisions, you know, in a structured, logical, and measured way, and those tools have to be used now. And it might be, the last bit of the answer is, it might be that the answer comes out of that pleases some and doesn't please others, and some people can live with that disagreement and some people can't, and that's the reality of it. That's a very, very interesting, it's a very good question, thank you. And I think that, you know, that sort of thing, it applies for a board and it also applies to a management team, doesn't it? But you know, you have to try to use facts. You've got to try to use some logical decision making based on facts, and then, you know, people have got to get on board with the decision or not.
Perfect, thank you so much. And Stephen is asking, when developing a strategic plan, what are your thoughts on the length of the plan and the frequency of plan reviews to address market changes?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Very good questions from the audience, Red. So we've got a bunch of stats on this actually, which I'm happy to share afterwards somehow, in terms of how long are people's plans. You know, 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, 10. Off the top of my head, the vast majority of planning is in the 3 to 5 year range. Some organizations, particularly large charities, have you know, up to 10-year plans. We've seen lots of those. But the vast majority of organizations are in the 3 to 5 year. My personal viewpoint is actually 3, because I feel that sort of going beyond 5 nowadays, and I don't know whether it's an age thing, but nowadays, you know, predicting things beyond 3 years, I just think is getting harder and harder, right? So I think 3 years is good. Other behaviors we see are, we see a lot of organizations running quarterly key results within a strategy. So you might have a 3-year plan, but they're running hard every quarter on quarterly key results. That's quite a common behavior we see. And I think the other aspect, a couple of other points in terms of how frequently you should be reviewing things. I really do think management needs to be reviewing strategic progress actually on a weekly basis. And I think boards ought to be reviewing things on a monthly basis. We tend, I think that's good practice, and lots of people do that. You tend to see management doing it monthly and boards quarterly. But I think actually both teams need to row it back a little bit and do weekly and monthly. And I think the last aspect of your question is how quickly do you change things? Well, I guess that depends on what's happened externally. There could be a change externally, you know, like the war in Ukraine is an obvious and current example, which actually particularly affected the software industry, because a lot of people had development teams in the Ukraine that all of a sudden were, you know, distressed or not there. So you can have an external factor, which means you've got to react, of course. But otherwise, I would say reviewing things weekly and monthly, and then you probably want to come up for air properly on an annual basis, where you really take a step back and think, does this still feel and look right? And have that offsite and get some space and get that time to really take a look at things. That's my answer to those points. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Jeffrey's asking, with a potentially weak executive leadership team, how best to lead from the board, affecting changes in culture, macro, goals, micro, or both with respect to ongoing governance? And do you see the board lead strategy very often? I guess that's two questions.
Yeah, no, another great question. Yeah, interesting. So I think that comes back to that interaction between board and management team, board and chief executive. I think there's probably a few factors going on there, aren't there? Has a board brought the chief exec in and they're performing or not performing? Or has someone inherited someone else, and perhaps relationships aren't great? I don't know. I think that the offsite involving some of the board and the management team is a good forum to perhaps address some of these questions. I think the whole board showing up to an offsite is probably a bit over the top. But I think some of the board showing up to perhaps engage with the management team and discuss some of these issues is a really, really good idea. Ultimately, the board, in most organizations, the board has control over, who the chief executive is. But of course, removing and replacing a chief executive is not something to be done lightly, because of course the knock-on impacts to the management team and also the organization can be really significant and significantly distracting for quite a period of time. So there's quite a lot of thorny issues there, actually, in a small question. I think the short answer to your question is to get the right people from the board in an offsite with the management team and actually have some proper face-to-face discussion about what these issues are. And that agreement of, as I touched on in the slides, the agreement of, for this organization and this board and management team, what is the strategy? Is it about planning? Is it about culture change? And equally, what role does the board play? Is it advisory or is it supervisory, for example? And those two questions really need discussing, and it needs agreeing, and it probably needs documenting, and it probably needs communicating as well. And that's probably a good start to what you're touching on, is some very, very complex issues.
Great, Tom. And thank you very much. I know that we still have a few questions, but we are running out of time. So we will definitely follow up with you with those questions. And Tom also has a great offer for you that you will see in the follow-up email that you will receive with both this recording as well as the slides. So thank you, Tom, for answering these questions and for your time. If you could help me get to the farewell slide, that would be great. And we're just going to run through 3 quick things before we leave you. For further information on Shaparency and to schedule a demo and to access that free 14-day Shaparency test drive I mentioned earlier, you find that on Shaparency.com. To enroll in our global education, board education and certification course, the IBDC.D education that I mentioned, and up your game to a modern day board director, you can visit Shaparency.com/board education. And to sign up for upcoming events, you will reach that at Shaparency.com/events. And next month's webinar is going to be Anatomy of a Future Director with Paul Smith. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today. And thank you again, Tom, for spending some time with us. From me and the entire Shaparency team, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.